Corrina Gould is the spokesperson for the Confederate villages of Lishan and Ohlone. She was born and raised in Oakland, California, in the territory of Huichin. And I apologize if any of the pronunciation is off. Doing my best. Corrina has worked on preserving and protecting the ancient burial sites of her ancestors in the Bay Area for decades. And she's the co-founder and lead organizer for Indian People Organizing for Change, a small native-run grassroots organization, and co-founder. She's also co-founder of the Sagreta. Okay, she'll fix it for me. Land Trust. Well, yeah, sorry. It's an urban indigenous women's community organization working to return land to indigenous stewardship in the San Francisco's East Bay. Please welcome Corrina Gould.
Horshe tuhi ka'at lashanka ka'at ra'at Corrina. And so I just spoke to you in the very first language of my ancestors, the very first language here in Berkeley, and it's called Xocheño. My great-grandfather, Jose Guzman, was one of the last speakers of the language. And so I'm so happy to be here today to be a part of Berkeley Earth Day. For the last 3 years, I've been doing an immense amount of work here in the city of Berkeley, which is part of Huichin. And Huichin actually is a territory of Ohlone people that live here in the Bay Area since time immemorial. We have an unbroken tie to this land. And Huichin actually encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Alameda, Albany, Berkeley, Emeryville, and Piedmont. Piedmont just told me a couple of months ago that they wanted to be added because they are a city. So I come to you today to talk about Earth Day and what is it that Indigenous people can offer to Earth Day. And I think that one of the incredible things that we need to wrap our minds around is that Indigenous people all over the world have had an unbroken tie to their responsibilities to the lands on which they were born. And that all kind of changed when there was this industrial revolution in the world. And people moved all over the place and started to create things. And today we're celebrating, or some people are celebrating, this thing called Easter. And yesterday people celebrated Passover. And in March we had spring equinox. And tomorrow we're having Earth Day in different places as well. And so I'm thinking about what does that mean when we're looking at this time of year? Because all of those things tell us that we're at a time of renewal, a time and place where things are changing and growing and things are being born into being again. And so this relationality that people have to their lands and places, but also the plants that are coming to give us medicines and foods are starting to sprout. And the flowers are coming out so that the bees that help us out to pollinate our food are coming out, and the bears are coming out of hibernation, and all of these little bugs that are beginning to crawl out and to help us under the earth. And so all of these things that are changing during this time, when we call it during the East time, right? The time of spring, the time of renewal, the time of a time of new beginnings. Right now we're at this place in the world where we're about to face this climate disaster, this chaos that is coming at us. And I really believe as an adult and as a grandmother that it is our responsibility not to hand it over to the next generation. But it is our responsibility to try to fix as much as we can before we leave this earth. And so the work that I've been doing for over 20 years is about protecting and preserving the sacred sites of my ancestors. And what does that have to do with climate disaster? Climate disaster has everything to do with the sacred. It is because we are removed from our sacred that we're in the place that we're at today as human beings. So I do this work because of my Chocchokmo. My Chocchokmo are my grandchildren. These three little monkeys I get to go hang out with later on today. And I have a fourth one who's only 4 months old. And it's my responsibility as an Ohlone woman, as their grandmother, and as a human being to this earth to do whatever I can in order to make sure that there is balance in this world again. So that my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and those generations out will have fresh water and fresh air and good land and places where they can have ceremony. And so I have a huge responsibility because the history of our people here on this land has been one that has been fraught with a lot of disaster already. There's a lot of pain in the land on which we live here in Berkeley and in the Bay Area because of things that happened to my ancestors. This next slide is a little weird, but it shows that there's actually 8 different Ohlone tribes, and we had 8 different languages and 8 different creation stories. And when folks first got here, they decided that we all kind of looked alike, we all kind of dressed alike, we all kind of had similar foods, and so they named us all Costanoan. And so that was the name that the Spaniards gave us when they first got here. So my ancestors put down all of these village sites that you see on this map. You can see Hu Chin, where we're sitting now. My ancestors are directly tied to this land. We're also tied to Yaquin, which is San Leandro, San Lorenzo, Hayward, Castro Valley area, and Irguin, which is Hayward, part of Hayward and Union City, all the way down to about Fremont area and out into the near where Pleasanton is. And so our ancestors have been here since the beginning of time. But across the way, you'll see cities like San Francisco, whose original name was Yalamu, and down in Fremont, where the original area was called Tuibun, and down in Tamian area, where San Jose is Tamian. And so we had names and space and places for all of these things. These were traditional territories. And traditional territories is not like private land ownership that we think about today. Right? Private land ownership has these boxes and squares and rectangles, but our traditional territories were often bordered by waterways and our sacred mountains. And so our sacred mountain is Tuyushtak, and Tuyushtak is what we know today as Mount Diablo. For thousands and thousands of years, my ancestors named this mountain where we were created on Tuyushtak, a place of sacredness. In 200 years, it has been changed to Mount Diablo, or the Mountain of the Devil. And so we have to think about, what does that mean in 200 years? When I talk to folks, I say, when you look at the Bay Area, all its beautiful buildings and all of the bridges that we have here and all of the greatness that's coming out of the Bay Area, everything that you see here has only been here for 200 years. So you have to imagine 200 years ago, a little blip in history, when you could drink out of the waters from Strawberry Creek, from every creek in the Bay Area you could drink fresh water from. There were salmon and rainbow trout that would come up these creeks that would sustain the people that lived here. 200 years ago, there was no such thing as homelessness or hunger in the Bay Area. And when we talk about bringing forward-thinking society, we have both of those things here today in our territories. We have tons of people that are without roofs. We have people that are hungry every day. And there's not really a reason for that. We're the 5th largest economy in the world in the state of California. I talk to young people a lot about the past and the present and what does that mean, because we are often depicted as in the past. So the picture on this side is a picture that depicts my ancestors hundreds of years ago, maybe. And it's on 4th and University in Berkeley. You guys know where that's at? It's on the overpass of University Overpass underneath there. And it's there for a particular reason. But I won't talk about that yet. On the other side, you'll see some young people that are dressed similarly. Now, this is called regalia. Can you guys say regalia? Now, can you say regalia is not a costume? Yeah, regalia is not a costume. Regalia is something that's very special to indigenous people. Not just my people that live here and have always lived here, but all indigenous people have regalia that is very specific to ceremonial ways of life. And when I talk to fourth graders, I often talk to them about who dressed up for Halloween, right? And what did you dress up like? And did you have fun? And do you know where your costume is today? And most kids will tell me it's, pieces of it are here or there. Some of it might be in the trash. Some of it might also be at a Goodwill. Sometimes they don't know where any of it is. But that's never true about regalia. For indigenous people, regalia is alive. So when these young people choose to take on the dancing of this particular ceremony, they have to learn special songs, and they have to learn special prayers, and they have to wake this regalia up. And as they wake this regalia up and they put it on, they become something other than themselves. They become these spirits that are now dancing for the health and healing of their people, but also for the earth. So it's a huge responsibility to take that on. And when they take this regalia off, they have to sing it back to sleep and put it away in a very special way so that it's never in Goodwill or shoved under your bed or in a closet or all over the place. And so when we talk as human beings today in 2019 about mascot issues, we have to wonder why it is that people still believe that it's okay to use someone else's culture to play something, to be made up. This is a true culture of people that are continue to live and thrive here, to put down these prayers on their traditional territories. And those prayers are not just for the Ohlone people or people that are in the plains or wherever it is that people decide to take on these different traditions. It is for the health of everyone that now lives in our territory. We are relearning our songs and our dances again today. Our songs and dances went to sleep. The language that I spoke to you in, Chochenyo, my great-grandfather, Jose Guzman, was alive until 1939. And he spoke to this guy named J.P. Harrington. And I truly believe that my ancestors were in people's ears so that I could be here today to talk to all of you, right? That I believe that the way that colonization happened in our territory was to eradicate us from this land forever. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But these songs and dances are coming back to our lands through dreams and through remembrance. This man, J.P. Harrington, was a linguist, and some people think that he was crazy. And there's folks that are actually trying to still go through a lot of his notes and stuff, and he had tons of notes, and not just for Ohlone people, but for indigenous people through lots of California and even Mexico. Because J.P. Harrington had it in his idea that colonization was happening, and was happening so rapidly that these languages were going to die if he didn't write them down. And so we're thankful that he got this bug in his ear from our ancestors, and he wrote down the words of my great-grandfather, and he recorded them on wax cylinder, and they're preserved at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., to bring back our songs and our dances to this land again for our healings so that we could talk about this today. And so J.P. Harrington died alone. His wife divorced him because he was broke, but he saved many of the languages that are now being brought back by California Native people today. As we're reawakening our languages, you could see all of the people that are on this side of the slide are at a gathering where they're all learning different languages that J.P. Harrington preserved. People are bringing those languages back. Some of them had a few language carriers still, and some, like our tribe, had none. So we are tasked with talking about why it's important for us, not only as Ohlone people to learn this language, but for people that are outside of our tribal people to know what these languages are. So this says, this is Ohlone land. We must be the voices of our Chocokmo. 2 years ago, there was a walk for climate justice in Oakland, and we created this sign. And who remembers what Chocokmo means? Grandchildren. So we must be the voices for our grandchildren. A couple of 100 years ago, kids were doing the same things that kids are doing today, right? And human beings haven't changed so much. We think that we've gotten far, right? We see kids that are climbing trees, and who hasn't climbed a tree when they were a kid, and running races or helping their mom in the kitchen. Same things were happening here for thousands of years. We have not changed as human beings so much as modernization and putting walls around us, right, and creating electricity and stuff. We're still doing a lot of the same stuff. And this is the mission system. Anybody grow up here in California? Learn about the mission systems? Yep. Anybody build a little mission as a part of a project in 4th grade or so? All right, so the mission system was created, but this is right. And I asked 4th graders, you guys know what calling dibs is? Yeah. So if I have a pink box, what's the pink box? Y'all don't know what a pink box is? No? What comes in a pink box? What? Cake? Yeah. Donuts? Pastries? Yep. All right. If I have one left in there, and you call dibs, what does that mean? You get that. You get that last one, right? So imagine how Spain got California, this part of California. Around 1546, 1547, there was a Spanish ship that was floating along the coast of California. And without getting off and talking to any of my relatives or most of anybody else, they called dibs on this land for Spain, for the crown and for the church. And that's how Spain stole the land from our people. But they didn't come back for a couple of 100 years. Craziness, right? They came back a couple 100 years later because they were afraid Russia was going to get this land that they called dibs on. You see, Russia was up in Northern California having fur trade with Northern California people. And so Spain freaked out and decided that they were going to hold the land by creating these missions. They had done a wonderful job of colonization in what is now Mexico and the indigenous people there by using this tactic. And so my ancestors were met with these Spaniards, right? This guy named Junipero Serra came, and he was super excited about holding down the land for the Spanish church. And my ancestors were enslaved at Mission Dolores in San Francisco and Mission San Jose in Fremont. We don't talk about the slavery of California Native people. My ancestors were forced to build what I call the first prison industrial complex of California. They built these missions and then were forced to stay there. And 2/3 of them died in the 99 years that it was open. This prison system killed my ancestors through introducing them to diseases, by outright murdering people that were running away from them, by working them to death, by beating them to death, and by starving them to death. The nutritional value of the food that people were fed in the mission systems was less than the food that was given to people in Auschwitz. So many of our ancestors died because they were introduced to new foods and didn't have medicines as well. After they closed down, they were secularized by Mexico, and the gentry decided that they wanted the land. And they gave out huge swaths of land in these Mexican land grants to people like Vallejo and Bernal and Peralta. And so my ancestors literally went from being slaves at these missions to being slaves on these ranchos. And pretty soon there was a war against America and Mexico. The Mexican-American War had this treaty, this pretty famous treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe de Hidalgo. And in that treaty, it said that California Native people were supposed to be returned to some of their land. At the time that California was created, the United States was not about creating treaties with Indians any longer. It was about creating extermination laws. Some of the very first laws created in the state of California was to kill Native people. $5 a head and 25 cents an ear. We don't talk about these histories in our history books. We don't learn about this in 4th and 5th grade when we're learning about my ancestors. And then we're forgotten in the history books. It's a part of paper genocide by not talking about the history and then not talking about people still being here. And so my ancestors survived by pretending that they were Mexican until it was safe for us to come out and talk about our history again. And really, it's only been in my lifetime that we've been able to stand up and speak on behalf of our ancestors and our ways of life. I began to work around preserving and protecting our sacred sites in the Bay Area in 1999. We found this map Nels Nelson had created in 1909. He knew that there was so much development happening in the Bay Area at that time that these shell mounds or burial sites of our ancestors were going to be totally lost if he didn't create this map. He went around the Bay Area and found 425 shell mounds that ring the Bay Area. These were places along the bay where fresh water met salt water, where my ancestors had created these mounds that grew and grew through burials of our people. The largest one was created at Emeryville. The Emeryville shell mound was over 3 stories high and 350 feet in diameter. So if you can imagine 3.5 football fields. It was so huge, it was on an 1857 Coast Survey map, so that people coming into the Bay Area would use it as a point of reference. You see, a few hundred years ago, our ancestors could eat as much shellfish as they wanted to without worrying about anything. And so because there was such an abundance here in the Bay Area, if you think about what the Garden of Eden and that story is about, it would have probably been here in the Bay Area. There was so much abundance of foods here. The weather was beautiful and perfect here. And there was synchronicity between the seasons and the human beings that lived here. So my ancestors lived on these shell mounds. They had ceremonial places on here. They were places where we could light fires, and because there was no electricity, you could actually see the fires across the bay at night. You can send warning signals to people across the bay if it was red tide and it was time to stop eating the shellfish. You could see each other and send signals about big happenings that were going on. But most people didn't understand what the shell mounds were because my ancestors actually left a very small footprint in the Bay Area for thousands of years, they left a small footprint. Our houses, our boats, our clothing, our basketry, almost everything we made was biodegradable. Our nets for fishing, and the only things that we left were these monuments of our ceremonial places and our cemeteries where we buried our dead. Almost out of all 425 of them, almost none of them exist anymore. Because no one in the Bay Area actually knew what shell mounds were before we started talking about them, we created this shell mound walk between 2005 and 2008. And we walked from the top of our territory up in Vallejo down to San Jose and up to San Francisco. So when we think about ancient village sites, we do not think about people who are sedentary and is just stuck in one place. Human beings move. So it takes 3 weeks to walk around the bay, 18 miles a day. But during that time when we were doing these walks, we would stop at all of these shell mounds. And we would stop at parking lots and railroad tracks and bars and schools and apartments and streets, because that's where our shell mounds had been. But we knew that no matter what was taken off the top of the land, so much more lay buried underneath. And so we said our prayers to these ancestors for 4 years. And each year we would find ourselves back at the Emeryville Mound, where we, for 20 years, starting this year, will be 20 years, we gather with hundreds of people to talk about the history of the land, to offer our prayers and our songs, to hand out information to people who come there to shop and ask them not to shop there, and gather there with family and cookies and tea and have a good time. So you are welcome to come on the day after Thanksgiving, the biggest shopping day of the year, on the corner of Ohlone Street and Shell Mound Way, to say, to honor our ancestors, to remember the first people of this land, who the city of Emeryville decided not to, and to help us out by giving out information. So from noon to 3 o'clock. We work with other California Native people around saving salmon, around protecting the water, and not just for us, but for everybody that lives in California now. I work with a very special woman. Her name is Chief Colleen Sisk of the Winnemem Wintu people. She is, her tribe believes that they have the voice given to them since the beginning of time by the salmon. There's a story that I was told that the Spanish wrote very great diaries about what they saw here. And they were chasing a few of my ancestors from around Richmond area, and they got to the Carquinez Strait, and they lost my ancestors. But during that time was a salmon run. And they wrote in their books that there was so many silverbacks of salmon you could practically walk to the other side. In our lifetimes, in a few hundred years, we have never seen a run of salmon of that sort. For 4 times a year, we used to have salmon run through our bay, up our Carquinez Strait, to our delta, where these magic fish would turn from saltwater fish back into freshwater fish. And as they would go home up their river, not any other river, their bodies would be cleaning the bottom of the riverbeds so that we would have fresh water. Their bodies would be decomposing on the side so that it would give nutrients to the plants and the trees that were there by the river. They would be giving their bodies to us as food. And they would go all the way to the top of their own river, and they would lay eggs and have babies and die. These relatives of ours are important to us. And they shouldn't just be important to the indigenous people, but all people. Human beings have gone away from being a part of the sacred. We believe that we are above all other beings on this earth, and that's where we have gone awry. I've been working on this Saving the West Berkeley Shell Mound for 3 years now. This was the very first of the 425 shell mounds that ring the Bay Area. This was the very first place that human beings set up a ceremonial place and a homestead right here in Berkeley on 4th and University, where the bay used to come up and Strawberry Creek used to run across what looks like a parking lot right now. On 1900 4th Street, we've been trying to stop a development from going up. A development that would destroy the rest of the shell mound that was there. The very first place that my ancestors lived along the bay, where children first laughed and cried along the waters. Where the first place that human beings ever put a sinker into the bay to catch fish. This is the place that my ancestors were directed by our Creator to set up along the waterways. It is directly connected to a place we now know as Alcatraz. Alcatraz is an island that we believe when someone dies, our spirits would go and sit there for 4 days while their relatives had ceremony on the land on this side. And at the end of those 4 days, our ancestors are believed to go through our western gate, where the Golden Gate Bridge now sits. This is part of our cosmology. It is who we are as human beings. When the developer came and talked to us finally, because there was so much public pressure to have them consult with other Ohlone people, they met with us and we told them this story. This was the idea they had for 4th Street. Luxury condominiums and apartment buildings, big box retail. And we said no from the very beginning. And we had help from people of all walks of life, people from all over Berkeley that kept up the Landmarks Commission and the Zoning Board up until 2:30 a.m. listening to us. We had people write 1,800 letters on behalf of protecting and preserving this site. About a year ago, the developer decided to change their entire plan, and they invoked for the very first time SB 35, a law that was created by Senator Weiner and, her name will come to me in a second, Nancy Skinner. We went to Nancy's office and talked to her about this sacred site. More than one time we talked to her staff. And when we found out that developers were going to evoke this law, we went up to Sacramento and talked to Senator Weiner, who was surprised that Indians even existed in the Bay Area and had no intention with this law to have this destroy a sacred site, but said quite clearly, well, that's going to have to be taken care of in the courts. When they changed this, they said they were going to add a half of their property would be used for affordable housing. Affordable housing that we know none of the people that are living underneath the freeway ramps there could afford. Affordable housing that many of the students at UC Berkeley can afford. Many of the people that are living in tent cities and in RVs inside of our cities cannot afford what they call affordable. But the only idea that human beings had was these beautiful designs that was created by their architects. And I always believe that my ancestors put people in my life for a reason. So there was a man who came up to me during one of those zoning board meetings and said, I'd like to help you. His name is Chris Walker, and he is a landscape architect, and his family created the 9/11 Memorial in New York. They're redesigning one of our cemeteries for the United States. They've created beautiful spaces in Australia for Aboriginal people. And he said, let's do this instead. Let's give the Zoning Board and Landmarks Commission and the people of Berkeley something different that they could look at, other than these boxes that's not going to last. Let's create a mound there on that site. But this actually wouldn't dig into the land. It wouldn't disturb anything underneath. You see, some years ago, there was some college students that were given a contest. And the contest was to talk about how they could create a structure that would withstand a bomb hitting it without a candle going out. And they created these cement-like oval structures that do just that. They could take an impact. But since they started, they created that, they also figured out design-wise, you could use these in all kinds of ways all over the world, and people have been using them as part of landscape architecture. So if we would create one there that's about 20 feet high, you could see what my ancestors saw by walking all the way up to the top. And we could cover it with poppies, and 4 months out of the years it would be bright orange. We could open up Strawberry Creek where it had originally gone across that land. We could build the land up, and we could plant trees. We could create a green space. We could put a dance arbor there that my ancestors have not had in our territory in 250 years. We could create a theater, something like this, that was totally circular. And you could see, hear, feel, and smell what it was like to be at a shell mound 250 years ago. And every fourth grader that has to learn about my ancestors would be able to go someplace where they could not only talk about the history, but the resiliency of Ohlone people still on their own land. Would that not be a better idea? We have had a huge community response coming out to 4th Street and creating beautiful murals on the land with us. We had a 4th grader that came and spoke up. And this really gives me hope. We talk about how we're in this climate chaos right now. And we had this 4th grader that created this little magazine, and she presented it to the zoning board as part of public comment about preserving and protecting the West Berkeley Shell Mound. And when I talk to young people, I tell them they don't have to wait until they're adults, that they have a right to speak in public, to write letters on behalf of things, and to create organizations that will help to save the world if that's what they want to do. We are looking at Gertrude, who is standing up strong for the earth right now. We have young people in the United States that are suing our government because we as human beings, as adults, are not protecting the earth, the land, the water, and the air so that they have a better future. So it's now time for us to listen to our children. We're told that we do not own the land, but that we are borrowing it from the generations yet to come. We have to embody that today. When we begin to think about the earth, we have to think that we are human beings that were given a direct teaching to do here, that we are supposed to live alongside of everything else that was created. We were created, and so was everything else on this earth. That does not make us better than anything else that's been put here. I'm working right now to preserve land in a different way. I'm working with other indigenous women we've created the Segorite Land Trust because in 2011 we retook over a 13 acres of open space on the Carquinez Strait after fighting for 11 and a half years to save and protect 2 shell mounds that are there. We were able to create the first cultural easement between a federally recognized tribe, a city, and a park district. But that doesn't stop us from having to protect the land. What we found while we were there for 109 days was that we lived with people from all walks of life who had all kinds of different belief systems, who learned to live together in a village, much like would have been there a few hundred years ago. People learned how to eat together and to pray together and to protect something together. Each person figured out what it was in their life to do at that site. When they turned off the water, there was a gentleman who had to go to work every day. And his job, he figured out for himself, was to bring water for everybody. And so he would bring water in the morning before he went to work. He would come by after work and collect the empty containers and do that all over again. People would bring wood for the sacred fire that was lit. People would bring food. Other people would stand up as folks that were security, as we were being watched by the Coast Guard and Homeland Security and the police. We had people that did all of these things, but what we did was when we left that space after 109 days, we realized that we had become human beings again. When we went home, it was difficult for us to think about going into our doors and shutting it at night, not knowing who our neighbors were anymore, not eating with people or praying with people or dreaming with people about how we could have a better world. Society today has put us in these boxes where we can't think outside of laws that were created. If we as human beings can be creative and let go of some of those things that are holding us back, there would be no such thing as homelessness or hunger worldwide. We would be able to put the priorities back into order. We would not be in climate chaos right now. What I'm offering you today on Earth Day from Indigenous people is for us to remember how to be human beings again. For us to remember how it is that we come together in community to take care of one another. For us to remember that our jobs is to ensure that everything that we were created with has the same rights as us. Water is alive. When you pray to water or you sing to water or you tell water it's beautiful, these beautiful crystals are created. When you curse at it and you say bad things to it or you pollute it, the crystals turn into something ugly and mucky. Water is a medicine for us. We have almost totally destroyed all the water in the world. We have to imagine a world where we don't have fossil fuels, Imagine a world where we can go back in order to go forward. Go back to village life so that everything we need is within walking distance or biking distance. So that we have hospitals and schools and everything and food production for our children within those spaces. And that when we decide to leave this earth, we know that as human beings, we have done everything possible to ensure that there's fresh water, fresh air, and good soil for the next 7 generations and beyond. Thank you.